I want to express our regret and, of course, convey our apology to the rest of the country. The fact that one, we're experiencing load shedding, and two, that we're experiencing the intensity of load shedding that we haven't experienced in a long time.
Hello, darkness, my old friend. Rolling blackouts are back again. But if sentiments expressed by the electricity minister is anything to go by, they're seemingly light at the end of the tunnel. It's topical, and it starts right now. A very good evening to South Africa, those watching around the world. My name is Blaine Herman, and this is It's Topical, our digital audience tonight, popping up on your screen, joining us from the universities of Pretoria and the Northwest. They will weigh in terms of some of the burning questions they have for our guest in a short while. Now, Stage 6, rolling blackouts. However, the electricity minister saying today that they continue to be on the right path, describing this as getting hit by adverse headwinds, which they say they anticipated. Further, he tried to give assurances to those who want to invest in the South African economy that they must continue to have the confidence there's ability to resolve this problem. To that end, Eskom, keeping the lights on, it's crucial, right? New generation capacity, the private sector coming on stream. It's something the Finance Minister, Groenewald, will likely take stock of when he finally tables the national budget set for March 12th. Economic reforms, fiscal objectives, the difference between percentages and percentage points. It's terms that fly over many heads. I know it has a tendency to fly over mine, despite my big forehead. But what we do understand well as a collective is job creation, the need to reduce poverty, the desperate need to tackle high cost of living. It's things that are more tangible. Why? Because you and I, we face this on a daily basis, right? Yes, our lived realities are different, but the net sum of our challenges tend to be similar and familiar. The tabling of the 2025-26 annual budget postponed to next month. So what does it do? It gives us an opportunity to explore these issues in greater detail. VAT, or value-added tax, it's an indirect tax on the consumption of goods and services in the economy. It's causing a stir. It's revenue raised for government by requiring certain traders or vendors that carry on an enterprise to register for VAT. Question: is it absolutely necessary to hike this tax? Or are there other ways to protect vulnerable citizens and lay a platform for economic growth? It brings us to the umbrella question of the week, and we're asking you, what avenues or what alternative revenue sources do you think that the government should explore to ease the burden, the tax burden that is? Let us know at SABC News_TV. Let's walk and talk. So, on one hand, you have the need to stabilize debt. Not death, death. On the other hand, you need to maintain a growing primary surplus. How? That's the big question. Where are the avenues of opportunity? Let us know your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you at SABC News_TV. Perspective coming up. Now time for your roundup. All right, the news always first on SABC News. People across the world are praying for Pope Francis as the Vatican reported that the Argentinian-born pontiff is in a critical condition in a Rome hospital. Now, yesterday, the Vatican said that the Pope's health condition had worsened to the point where he received supplement, oxygen, and blood transfusions. Francis is 88 years old. He has double pneumonia. We learned that he had suffered a prolonged asthma-like respiratory crisis. The Pope was admitted to hospital on February 14th after experiencing difficulty breathing for several days. This morning, the Vatican said Pope Francis had a peaceful night and rested well. Now, the Pontiff's X page. Let's show you this tweet. It remains active, right? And there were 2 tweets that have so far come throughout today. One of them reads, have a look. I have recently received many messages of affection, and I have been particularly struck by the letters and drawings from children. Thank you for your closeness and for the consoling prayers I have received from all over the world. No doubt SABC News will keep you up to date with the very latest developments regarding Pope Francis. Now, news back home. Eskom Group Chief Executive Beki Ngomalo says that a plan is being implemented to combat the rolling blackouts implemented last night. This after Eskom announced stage 6 load shedding until further notice. Eskom briefed the media in Pretoria today. Take a look.
What are we looking for towards the rest of the week? As the Minister indicates, we anticipate to get out of the stage by the end of the week. With the recovery pace that we are experiencing thus far and anticipate for the rest of the day, we should be able to take a view around stepping down from the level of the stage 6 load shedding by tomorrow. And we will, on the basis of the actual recovery itself, make a call, and the recovery of our reserves, make a call in terms of how we step down stepwise to a point where we have paused load shedding for the remainder of the week. So this week is very important. The first 3 days are quite crucial in our recovery program. We are encouraged by the overnight recovery. We are clear with the plans that needs to be delivered for the rest of today. We'll take stock this evening and do the assessments in terms of how we step down from that part.
All right, let's tee up the discussions for you, what we know and why it matters. I want to welcome SABC News economics reporter Naledi Ngobo. She joins me now live. Thank you for your
Thank you so much for having me.
mind on this. We need your assistance in trying to understand this, right? We know nobody took for granted that passing the first budget under the GNU was going to be simple, given, as you can see, the various ideological stances. Now, where you can help us is take us through the process of how did we get to a point whereby the first or the national budget that was supposed to be last week was postponed.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Blaine. So it was quite a tumultuous set of events and situation that actually ensued before the tabling of the budget. Now, we know that since the 5th of February, there was already a presentation by National Treasury where they were presenting the budget framework to Cabinet at the time. And these are the plans that they make to say, this is what we plan to do, this is what our budget is going to be addressing. And this is the presentation they make in a special Cabinet meeting. And they had mooted the idea of a VAT increase at the time, although it wasn't said how much the increase would be. But that already had people, feeling unsettled. There was discontent amongst various Cabinet members about the fact that they want to increase VAT. And at that point, that's when we see the DA immediately after that meeting going to Godongwana saying that we as the DA don't support it. We think that you're putting the South African consumer under enormous pressure by increasing their VAT by this 2%. And then, there's no response from Godongwana at the time. And then the matter he takes it to his alliance partners. Now he meets with Cosatu, he meets with the SACP, he also meets with the National Working Committee of the ANC as well. And even there's no consensus about this VAT hike, although at the time there's still no real direction about what it's going to be. So just very much a discontent from the very word go.
Pull back the curtain for us. You and I were in Cape Town. Where were you at the time? When did you get a first indication that this was in fact going to be postponed?
While we are in Cape Town, I can, explain that, I was one of the journalists who was joining some experts who were in the lockup. Now, in the lockup, this is where we get an opportunity to look at the budget, review, and what the minister is going to be tabling, essentially. And during that period, that's when the minister then comes and tries to field a few questions based on, what we've seen in the budget. That's where he takes questions. And he did bring up the fact that, there was no cabinet meeting before the meeting that he was having with us. And already that had brows raised and people feeling like, this is unusual, it's unprecedented, what is the reason? And it was there that he said, there wasn't enough time, or the fact that he said the 2% was not presented because it would have some implications on the markets. So it wasn't necessary for him to present the proposed VAT increase at the time. But then we could see, it was quite clear that he felt that there was not going to be enough support for it. He knew that Cabinet would have some pushback when it comes to this 2% increase.
So consultations continue. Talk to us now with regards to the tax revenue collection. Where's the shortfalls?
Right. In terms of our tax revenue, remember that in the midterm budget, we were expecting a shortfall of around 22 billion. But we understand that the two-pot system did make somewhat of a contribution in terms of reducing that number. So we're not expecting a 22 billion shortfall anymore. We understand that it's at 19 billion. So that's the kind of what we're looking for, which is why government was saying that, they have some interesting, programs that they want to introduce in terms of allocations, and that's why they want to increase now revenue by about 58 billion, which includes this VAT increase.
Which takes us to the possible avenues for revenue collection. Where are the opportunities here? Where are the avenues here to other than a proposed hike on VAT?
Yeah, I mean, you've got here personal income tax. There has been some pushback, largely by markets to say, personal income tax is already quite high, especially considering the number of people that are paying taxes. You already have only around 7 million people paying taxes. Against a population of 62 million people. That's quite, a disproportionate amount of tax coming through. Corporate income tax, a lot of people said, why not go corporate? When we heard from the minister, he was saying that this might put off investors in terms of investing further in the economy, because our corporate rates are also considered to be quite high by international standards. So the fuel levy might be an option. There has been some talks of a wealth tax as well. So that's something that's, we are still waiting to hear if whether or not it can be a consideration. Loans are not necessarily a great idea, considering the fact that we've got a huge debt burden. Our debt to GDP is at around 75%. We're already at about 5.2 trillion in terms of the amount of debt that we have. So it's not a great idea, but government is certainly facing a challenge in terms of balancing its books, and it has to do so in making sure that it maintains fiscal stability, it protects the public good, and it grows the economy.
We only bring the smart people on this program. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
Naledi Ngobo is SABC News economics reporter. We'll take it forward in a short while with our guests. I want to get your sense, what you are thinking ahead of the tabling of the national budget March 12th. Our regular Word on the Street feature, we took to the various streets of Johannesburg, seeking, of course, diverse insights and perspectives on this topic. And this is what people had to say.
We cut down parliamentary salaries, and also we limit the intel they go, the security intel they go with, because you can get one minister using 10 cars for security, which dents the accounts.
Our country is actually rich in minerals, so they can actually take the minerals that they actually export out of their country into other countries where they add value, and then bring them back in our country with more value, and then selling them to us at a higher price. They can actually take those minerals, add value to them in the country, and then sell them to the other countries.
The government must make sure that he imposes much tax, especially company tax. He may increase that tax to about 40%.
The government can cut on parliamentary salaries. The benefits that they get, the salaries, I think they're very much steep. They can cut on those. and also they can cut on the unfruitless expenditure, whereby you find that the tenders that are not going forward in the meantime, then they prioritize whatever it is important in our country for now.
As Umam Angie said, if we can look at the government employees, start cutting down, or people having early retirement, so that new bloods, new ideas are pumped into the system, could be one of the solutions. Because also living on aid, I don't think it's a sustainable kind of situation.
How will the budget, which will eventually be tabled, affect you and your family? We'll discuss with our guests next. Welcome back. You're watching It's Topical. I want to go straight to my guest to unpack the upcoming tabling of the budget. How does this affect you and your family? That's what it boils down to, the people. I want to introduce my guests. Tonight we have Thoko Madonko, a member of the Budget Justice Coalition and Research at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University. We also have Matthew Parks, Cosatu Parliamentary Coordinator, and Michelle Groenewald, Economics Lecturer at the Northwest University. Thank you so much. Obviously, our digital audience is there as well. Please raise a virtual hand. I'll do my very best to get you on air. Matthew, maybe I can start with you with regards to one of the headlines of the day. State 6 load shedding, Eskom once again back in sharp focus, the need to strengthen and expand this national electricity transmission network. From Labour's point of view, what sort of reforms do you think is needed in order to establish a sustainable electricity distribution industry?
Yeah. Good evening. Thanks for having us. Look, I think the load shedding is a reminder that how fragile electricity supply remains. And look, I think we must congratulate Eskom and the municipal workers who really turned out the tide the past year, leave aside this current load shedding and the one about 2 weeks ago. It's still a huge improvement from the dark days, literally, we had about the beginning of last year. But look, the load shedding reminds us that Eskom remains extremely fragile. Yeah. The turnaround has really been based upon a correct approach to ramping up maintenance. But most of the power stations remain very old, and this is going to continue to happen. It's going to get worse as the age is set. There's only so much maintenance you can do. So it's a reminder we need to assist Eskom to get new generation on board. That's the fundamental solution. Right. Eskom's debt relief needs to be geared towards assisting that. But also we need to really help ramp out and roll out the 14,000 kilometers of new generation connection points, the distribution lines, to really make sure we have put in place the transmission lines. If you can resolve the 3 Cape provinces transmission lines issue, that can help to unlock huge amounts of renewable energy. So I think it has to be a reminder that we've done well, but we've got to really make sure we provide the support to Eskom to ensure we can finally overcome load shedding, because that alone gives us 1% of GDP growth, right, and then enables us to focus on other issues like transit and so on.
Right. Michelle, Matthew mentioned Eskom's debt relief arrangements. What do you make of it? Is it bearing fruit?
Well, I don't want to sound like a typical economist here, but I think it depends on who you ask. Yeah. So I'm always eager for economists in my profession to be a little bit more humble in acknowledging where their expertise are. Yeah. And so I don't profess to be an expert on Eskom. Yeah. Right. So I want to be clear and upfront in being humble as an economist, which doesn't happen frequently. But what I would say is that if you're listening to certain quarters, the over 250 billion rand bailout that was given to Eskom, and the way in which, if you did read the budget speech that was not to be, there was yet again a discussion around how we would simplify this debt relief package. I'm not quite sure exactly what the minister meant by that one, so perhaps we would have heard more around this. But I would really just encourage the general public, any analysts, to never fall prey to this idea that there is just a single component that is leading to the success of Eskom, or that can lead to its downfall, right? That we've seen a host of different measures, whether it be that there are more people that are having access to solar now, whether it be the fact that we supposedly have different leadership, whether it be this debt relief package, whether it be the various workers that are involved in this. So really to acknowledge the complexity of the situation without trying to give a single variable as the answer for why we might currently be experiencing, potentially, if my screen goes dark, load shedding at 8 o'clock.
Yeah, okay. We'll bear that in mind. We should be done by then. Thoko, in March 2023, Eskom put in place this generation recovery plan. And we heard today from the chair of the board saying that at the core of the plan, and he mentioned three things, was the need to have the right leaders to execute the plan. There was a focus on the basics, basically the standard operating procedure, as well as discipline. Discipline in terms of doing what they said they were going to do. What's the sentiment on the ground? What's your assessment of how they're faring so far?
So, good evening and good evening to the viewers. I would agree with Matthew that, we should congratulate the extent to which we've been able to keep the lights on. The big question, and I sound like a broken record when I say this, is that the devil is in the detail. Yeah. And it's also about the way we talk about Eskom. And so this idea of bailouts, this idea that they don't somehow need money, that there's somehow huge amounts of money being wasted, which there is. But at the same time, we need money in order to build up Eskom to be able to provide the kinds of generation that Matthew mentioned. Yeah. So we also need to start thinking differently about Eskom and think about it as our Eskom in the same way that we need to think about our Transnet and our water services. Because if we don't see these as infrastructure projects that are critical to the functioning of our economy, not as this somehow ball and chain, but actually something that will kickstart our economy, we're not going to see the amount of money needed to generate the kinds of energy. And we have many South Africans that are energy poor. So the ability of Eskom to provide decent renewable energy is critical for the majority of South Africans. And so we need to be backing, as Michelle has said, this complex system, but we need to back it. And so this discussion about bailouts tends to obfuscate the fact that Eskom needs money to run. We need workers running Eskom. Those are jobs. We don't have separate employment figures for different sectors of the economy, for be it public or Eskom or our SOEs. It's all one economic system and one labor system. So if we lose jobs in one sector, we're losing jobs overall, which is going to harm our economy and harm demand in our economy. So, in sum, I think the most important thing for us to do is to change the language around Eskom, to say what kind of generation, what kind of energy can we provide that is pro-poor? The Budget Justice Coalition is very clear on making sure that our budget is needs-based and pro-poor and rights-based as well in terms of our constitution.
Michelle, there's a lot of competing interests, and it takes us to the issues of what the budget, once it's tabled, is likely to reflect. There's spending pressures in terms of health, education, security, transport. How best can these pressures be supported?
I mean, to give a succinct answer, it's a debate about how those can best be supported. What I do think we have seen is that when we have various trade unions and we even have the Democratic Alliance, who arguably are very often on opposite sides of the spectrum in terms of various policy debates, agreeing that we don't want VAT increasing from 15% to 17%, then I think there's been a miscalculation on the part of the decision to potentially have implemented this policy. So I think what we really need to focus on, though, within the GNU is that we have to have a constructive debate with good economic modeling. And of course, we can debate models and their assumptions, and they're certainly not perfect. But if the Democratic Alliance is going to incidentally fall, in this case, on the right side of being against a VAT increase, we should be clear that for the Democratic Alliance, and this is perfectly fine, every political party will be for their own interests. But we need to be clear that they are against any sort of increase in new taxes, which realistically leaves us in an incredibly difficult position. Whereas I would say what we do need to take a look at is a comparative approach to, if we're not going to increase VAT, what are the other alternatives that are on the table, of which there are many, and we can unpack those, but things like a corporate tax, a wealth tax, being able to look at things like tax breaks that are being given for medical aids, being able to have discussions around industrial policy. These are discussions that we have to have with good modeling. We have a deficit of 337 billion. Now, I know that the DA is used to critiquing, but they need to now create. So they need to offer solutions that cannot be in the millions as suggestions, right? There needs to be policy proposals that they are putting on the table that are in the billions, with good economic modeling to be able to back that up in a relational way so that we can compare really difficult decisions that we need to make.
Right. Matthew, speaking about corporate tax, to what extent, if that is raised, to what extent will that discourage investment and job creation?
Look, it's a difficult thing. We operate in a very complex, competitive global world. And I think Namibia recently reduced the corporate company tax to, I think, about 23%, memory serves right. I think Eswatini went a little bit further to 14%. So it puts us in a little bit of a quandary that, do you get into a race in the bottom? But I think our fundamental point around tax is that, number one, capacitate SARS to enforce existing tax compliance. Because it makes no sense, absolutely, to say to 2/3 of society, it's not a wealth issue. Most people, working class people, are paying the taxes. It's a myth to say only the rich pay taxes, which is nonsense. Everybody pays tax. Even children pay tax when they go to the shops. But we think it's fundamentally unfair. It's immoral to squeeze those who pay tax, who abide by our taxes, personal income tax, VAT, etc.
Yeah.
And then to leave that third of society, that's 800 billion rand of tax uncollected. We think, number one, is we have an efficient machinery with the South African Revenue Service. They've done wonderful work under the Mandela and Mbeki administrations. They are recovering from the devastation of the state capture era. And let's give them the support to ramp up tax compliance. Let's give them a very clear target. We need to boost tax compliance by 2% each year. That's an additional 40 billion rand of money owed to the state.
Yeah.
And a lot of things, as Michelle is saying, people are abusing tax loopholes, and we must reduce those. And often it's wealthy people, wealthy companies who've got fancy lawyers and accountants who can find loopholes, but also to give SARS the tools they need. And SARS is very efficient. You can give them R1 billion, and they are confident they can increase tax compliance by 20 billion rand. So I think for us, that's number one. Let's look at the loopholes, number two. Let's look at where we can make sure the wealthy pay their fair share. I think for us, that's the critical issue. But to do a VAT tax side, yes, it might be the easy route for Treasury. It might sound nice on tables and graphs. But to workers who are drowning in debt, who are not coping with the electricity price hikes, with transport price hikes, with the cost of food, etc., whose wages don't keep pace with inflation, then politically, there's no amount of perfume you can put around it to make it smell nice. Right. And there is good things in the budget, but all of those get drowned out with a VAT hike, and we just simply can't accept it under any conditions.
Thoko, SAFTU put out a statement saying that corporate taxes or tax rates have been drastically reduced since the end of apartheid to appease private capital. And they go on to say, yet private investment has stagnated, economic growth has been sluggish, and unemployment remains at crisis levels. Your thoughts on avenues of opportunity here?
I think Matthew said it beautifully. He said it's the race to the bottom. And what has happened in our economic policy, which is really essentially a neoliberal policy, in which the priority is the freedom of capital to move fast, quickly, the sort of controls around labor, so that labor can be hired and fired very quickly, and so private property rights. And so when you put those two together in the South African system, at the height of the moment in which we had a national need to redress the injustices of the past, to ensure that we got an economy going for the majority of the population, we were subject to this new kind of thinking around the economy, which meant low taxes for corporations, reducing tax on high net wealth individuals, and then this hot money flow, so the rise of finance or the financialization of our economy. And so what happens is then you have this perfect storm in which the nation state or the state itself is unable to deliver on its rights-based obligations. And so South Africa has maintained quite a good system in terms of trying to balance the need to make good on the promises of the Constitution by providing grants, by providing no fee schools, by providing universal healthcare, primary healthcare. So we've been doing these things, but in a context where we've been making sure that there's a small state and a smaller state and a smaller state, and we've been squeezing and squeezing and squeezing the ability of the state to be able to deliver on these services, making gains for what should be public goods and should be freely available in terms of health, education, higher education, including higher education, in our opinion, is that this then drowns out the ability of the state to exercise and flex its muscles. So that's why we always hear Treasury talking about the market as opposed to the South African people. So they will tell us the markets feel this way, but they don't tell us what the South African people feel. And what has happened with this VAT crisis is that essentially you've got a broad base of parties as well as SAFTU and others saying that actually, no, the South African people see what you're doing and it is not enough to squeeze us. There are other opportunities, as Matthew has pointed out, that they can access in order to raise the funds that are needed to provide good quality education, good healthcare, good social protection, and to adjust the grants so that people can live with dignity and actively participate in the economy as opposed to poverty wages.
We need to take a quick break. We're looking at alternative revenue sources. What are these sources that we can squeeze, to use Thokozile's words, in order to ease the burden on taxpayers or the tax burden? Our digital audience will have their say next. Welcome back. You're watching It's Topical. Let's remind you about the question of the week, and we ask you, what alternative revenue sources do you think the government should explore to ease the tax burden? Please let us know at SABC News_TV. We've had a lot of responses. Let's put it up on the video wall, give you a sense of what people are talking about. Nadia is saying that reduce government and SOE salaries and benefits, downsize management staff at all parastatals, reduce VIP protection unit, scrap at least 10 ministries, place incrementally increasing tariffs on imported clothing. So says Nadia. Let's have a look at the next one. Zabonelo says you can't spend beyond your means. If there is no money or not enough money, there shouldn't be any further expenditure, says Sibonelo. Al-Mokwena says the government could encourage households to use their land for growing crops and create local markets for selling produce. This would boost food security, create income, and ease the tax burden on citizens. So, okay, let's hear what Michael has to say. Michael says VAT increase is not as bad if you increase the range of exempt goods and services or reduce rates on essential goods, example, food, medicine, public transport, doctors, education, certain infrastructure inputs, cement bricks in parenthesis, to protect low-income households and maintain progressivity. I want to talk a bit more on this as well with regards to expanding the zero-rated VAT items. We'll discuss that with our guests in a short while. I want to go to our digital audience. Kustas had his hand up. What's on your mind, sir?
Right. Okay, let's do this. Yes. Good evening, Blaine. Blaine, let me just touch base on Eskom. There's an elephant in the room that we're not discussing about Eskom. Is the power purchasing agreements that are now draining Eskom's balance sheet as it is. You're not supposed to be funding Eskom at this stage, but because the government has given them a debt of power purchasing agreements, let me tell you what the power purchasing agreement looks like. It's a take-or-pay contract. Show me which business, which company can ever succeed if I sign a contract with you that says take-or-pay contract. So the IPP sector right now is draining Eskom balance sheet so bad that it forces Eskom to increase tariffs because they've guaranteed 20-year contract with profits guaranteed. Now, who at Treasury sat down and says, you know what, let's give these IPP sectors guaranteed profits for 20 years. And guess what? Not even one newspaper has ever shown us one power purchasing agreement. You know why? Because those units are so expensive that if we were to open them up, you could see they were being ripped off. The country right now is at 400 billion rands in debt over at IPPs. For what? Ever since we had, guys, we now have got a revenue shortfall. So let's go back now to ways in which we can increase tax. I'm going to begin by saying that the government should not increase tax when they've got demonstrated ways to manage it prudently. Yeah. We have a president who's got a cabinet of 77 people, and he has no intention of drawing it down. Right. So why should corporate pay more? Why should South Africans go?
We heard you. Thank you very much indeed.
Demonstrated prudence to say, look, we've managed everything that we can. We have nothing. Then we can say to them, look, we are willing to pay more. There should not be increases, any taxes whatsoever.
Point taken.
Remain as it is. Reduce the expenditure at municipality level, at national government level, even at presidential level. Why don't you drive 7 cars? Why don't you just drive a Corona? Why you need a BMW?
Well, let's ask Michelle.
No
Let's bring in Michelle, a digital audience. Michelle Naidu. Agree, disagree with Kustas?
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much. I definitely agree and echo his sentiments, in the sense that I think there are two primary things that need to be focused on. And I think firstly, it's the mismanagement of funds and internal government expenditure, reducing an extremely bloated cabinet and addressing things like, minister benefits, minister salaries. And then the second thing I think is also, the government needs to also place some primary focus on investing resources into SARS that ensure that tax compliance is as efficient as possible. And I think those are really the two primary avenues that government needs to put dedicated focus in order to ensure that the budget deficit is addressed.
Right. Michelle, thank you very much indeed. Mandisa? And then we'll hear from Musa. Mandisa,
Good evening. Good evening. I do agree with both Ms. Naidu and Mr. Kutsa. The reason behind it is because there is a pressure between revenue sharing and revenue raising and actually spending it. So there isn't like a distinct way of, they want to cut expenditure and they also want to raise revenue. And there isn't a clear way of how they want to do it. It's just, and there isn't also, the GNU proves incompetency so they do not agree to one thing. And with regards to Eskom as well, I believe it can also be like a manipulation tactic, because every time the people do not agree to something, then we do experience load shedding. For example, the tariffs of electricity, and now it's the 2% that we did not give it to them. So now it's like we have to suffer for their own agreements that they do not have. They do not have an agreement to certain things, and then we have to suffer the consequences because they are not compatible and they lack competency.
Right. Mandisa, thank you very much. I've got your point. Musa, let's hear from you before we go back to our guest.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I think the first thing that we need to look at in terms of the VAT increase is that South Africans fear that the VAT increase is only going to fund the corruption, the incompetency and inefficiency that is happening in our government. And the two solutions that I have is that government needs to review its fiscal policy and government should downsize and delay certain positions that are not important in departments. Because when you look at our GDP, 16% of the public service goes to the GDP, meaning 16% goes in paying public officials and public servants. In terms, when we look at that, that percentage, if that percentage is eradicated, if that percentage is delayed, then the deficit that is missing, the government will be able to can fund itself.
Right, let's bring Matthew on that point. Matthew Parks, the salary for civil servants, the public sector wage agreement. To what extent does this bring certainty to the fiscus?
Look, it helps a lot. It's the first time I think in many, many years you've had unanimous agreement so early across between government and between Labour. It's a fairly modest agreement, but it will help many nurses, teachers, police officers who are really not paid that much, trying to cope with the cost of living. They've not actually had inflation-linked increases for a few years. And in fact, in 2020, they received no increase, which really kind of puts strain on them. But you have a 3-year agreement, which is the first of many years. So it makes it much easier for government to kind of plan for the next 3 years. This is what is being put aside. This year, it's slightly above inflation. The next 2 years, it's inflation-linked. I think there's a little bit of a myth to say the public service wage bill is out of control. It's not. About 2 decades ago, it was about 40% of the budget. Since 2008, for about 15 years, it was about 35% of the budget. And the last 2 years were significant, painful cuts across the state. It actually reduced to about 31% of the budget. What we've seen is a drain of skilled public servants, because people often have this myth that public servants are some sort of Topical sitting there on the hill, and they're not. It's 20,000 doctors, highly skilled professionals who can get paid far more in the private sector. It's about 100,000 nurses, people who keep our children alive when taken to hospital. It's about 350,000 teachers who educate our kids. It's about 200,000 police officers who keep our children safe. What we've seen is a decrease in the public service ratio. So in 94, we had 1.2 million public servants to 34 million South Africans. Today, population has nearly doubled to 64 million. We have the same number of public servants. So the ratio is ballooned. And that's dangerous because that means we have long queues at Home Affairs to get your ID documents. It means we have rising learner to teacher ratios, rising number of nurses to patients. So what we need to do, the issue is it's a growth crisis. The economy is not growing fast enough. So we've got to remove the obstacles to growing, whether it's efficient and affordable, let me underline affordable electricity for industry, for the economy to grow, whether it's efficient transit so mining, manufacturing, exports can get to the markets, or Metro Rail can get workers to work on time. So you've got to remove those obstacles, but also you've got to stimulate the economy, make sure the infrastructure programs are rolled out, provide support for SMEs, etc. And also the private sector too, it's not an angel. If you don't pay workers a living wage, who is actually going to afford to buy the goods that the economy produces? So we need to have a bit of a rethink, but get the fundamentals right, because simply thinking we can pay nurses less and some of the economy will grow is a fallacy. And I think it's time we actually dealt with the fundamental obstacles to growing an inclusive and a sustainable economy.
Right. The main mission, Thokozile, will be to mitigate the burden on the working class. If the route is taken to hike the VAT, expanding the basket of VAT zero-rated food items, including tin, vegetable, dairy, liquid blends, etc. I think there's a variety of meat products as well. Does this sufficiently then mitigate this burden on the working class?
So it depends on who you talk to. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer, but in my opinion and the research that I've done and the kind of work that we've done at the Budget Justice Coalition, but also in my role as a researcher at the Southern Centre for Inequality Studies based at WITS, is that the jury is out, because what has happened, and this was done in 2018 when they increased VAT by 1 percentage point, research was done and they extended the VAT, and it didn't help poor households. It further harmed poor households. And what happens is two things happen. One is that inflation related to goods that are zero rated, it doesn't mean that they don't go up. It doesn't mean that they're not subject to inflation. They still go up in price. And what the research has shown is that zero-rated goods tend to go up faster. So they become more expensive over time, regardless of the zero rating. The second thing is that the majority of South Africans are not purchasing those zero-rated goods already. They're already, a number of South Africans living on 38 Rand a day, with many children stunted and going to bed hungry. So they're not purchasing the goods that they're supposedly extending in the zero rating. The other thing around zero rating, the VAT and zero rating, is that it's very difficult for you as a consumer to know whether or not a price of something has gone up by 2 percentage points. You're not going to get your calculator out today to figure out whether milk has gone up by 2 percentage points or not. And so, as Matthew said, the private sector is not innocent here. They take advantage and say, all the prices are going up because everybody's experiencing the VAT 2 percentage increase. So we get even higher prices, which drives an even higher cost of living crisis. So that is a blunt instrument. It's extremely blunt, and it doesn't necessarily help poor households in the way that if we had an open conversation about, and I think Mandisa made this point, about the revenue-raising options that we have available to us and the sharing of the wealth of South Africa. We don't have a money problem in South Africa. Let's dissuade ourselves of that fact right now. What we have is a distribution problem or redistribution problem. We are not fairly distributing the fruits of this nation to those who can afford to pay and those who are in need. And we're also beginning to in your insert and the tweets, attack the role of the state, which is extremely dangerous, because who is going to provide the schooling, the health, the public transport, the electricity? Who is going to provide this? This will take us back to the 18th, 19th century, in which it was the sort of, the kind of survival of the fittest. Yeah. So we have decided as a nation, in terms of our constitution, that there is a role to play for the state to provide rights and responsibilities on the private sector to also do so. Yeah. And so it's about coming together so that, you could massage it in ways that would then, if you made sure that the child support grant was increased by, 15, 20, 30%, and that there was no fee schools completely across the board, so you can do some sophisticated economics and calculations, but it's a blunt instrument in our current fiscal policy that we have at the moment.
Michelle, we don't have a money problem, we have a distribution or redistribution problem. If that is indeed a fact, how do we sharpen our spending?
Yeah, so sometimes we get lost in all of the numbers, but I just want us to pause on a second for this number, and we can have lots of debates about exactly how we are measuring wealth. But just to point out that the best available data we have shows that 0.1% of South Africans own 25% of the wealth in South Africa, and these are conservative estimates, right? So we need to have a difficult and fundamental conversation that those who are in positions of power that stand to lose the most are never going to say, I've really thought about everything that the various participants had to say on It's Topical today. I have reflected, and I think I need to actually start paying a wealth tax, right? It's not going to happen. So I think what's really important around redistribution is for us to not have this all mentality in budgeting. So I agree completely with the digital audience, right? We need to take on issues of corruption. So what we need to be able to do is to say, we will ask fundamental questions about how we do redistribution and how we do growth and how we curb corruption, right? Yeah. And so, researchers are absolutely terrible at getting their research out there, but I would say that there's really fascinating research being done on active ways in which we can have anti-corruption strategies, which very briefly, I would just say that if you take a look at the documentation that we have, which is the anti-corruption strategy that the ANC has put out from 2020 to 2030, everything is a top-down approach, which is fines, which is that we need greater transparency, which is that you're potentially going to go to jail or you will be redeployed, whatever that might mean. But realistically, what I have been advocating for is that we need to build anti-corruption strategies into every single policy that we're going to implement. So if we're saying that we need to have an employment tax incentive, unfortunately, we wish it wasn't so, but there will be corrupt actors, both in the private and public sector. And so we need to ask ourselves preemptively, how are we going to curb that corruption in every single policy? That is a horizontal or a bottom-up approach to corruption. Otherwise, we continue to have the same conversation over and over around corruption. So I think that that's just a really important component to emphasize around this entire debate. And then I would just lastly really encourage that everything that's happened with VAT has made people care more about the budget than ever before. Yeah. We run loads of models. We have loads of numbers around this. But I think if anything, what is, a tiny little ray of hope at the end of the tunnel is that the average South African, beyond the quantitative data, on a qualitative lived experience level, starts to care about the budget when they don't need to have it explained to them that VAT would be terrible for their everyday, an increase in VAT would be terrible for their everyday lives. So I would really encourage South African citizens, more than voting once every 2, 4, 5 years, that realistically there is something such as like the Budget Tips Initiative. And every year, ordinary South Africans are allowed to make submissions in order to say, this is what I actually think should be considered. So we need to improve the level of discourse and critical analysis so that we have greater participation from more South Africans, so that our finance minister can't almost look at us with large eyes like he's so astounded that we would have to postpone the budget. But I think that there is a certain disconnect happening between what South Africans are feeling and living and breathing and what people in really powerful positions are able to decide on their behalf.
Important point. Matthews, I was listening to economist Duma Kubule saying that solve unemployment and then the deficit takes care of itself, right? Further saying that the deficit is not as high, South Africa's deficit that is, compared to international standards. Should there be a refocus here? Because the bottom line is that we need to create jobs.
Look, we would agree with Duma on the point that our fundamental issue is an economic growth crisis. We're sitting at 1% economic growth for the past decade plus, and that means you're not even able to absorb young people into the labor market every year. So unemployment is getting worse. In the past year, I think unemployment fell by 1.3%. And, sure, that's good news. But when you have an unemployment rate of about 41.6%, I don't think we've got 40 years to turn things around.
Yeah.
And, if your companies are working, if they're employing people, if workers have salaries, they can buy the goods, that means we're then generating the company, the income tax, the VAT tax that the state requires. Because, look, to be fair to government, we can keep cutting. There's only so far you can go. And we are seeing the collapse of many state institutions. We have about between 12 and 3 dozen municipalities who routinely are not able to pay staff salaries. Some, yes, is because they're mismanaged, they're corrupt, etc., it's fine. But fundamentally, it's a funding crisis, it's a growth crisis. So we need to do the hard issues on, tinkering here, reducing here. That's fine, but that doesn't resolve the issues. And we'll continue to be in this crisis next year and the year after that. So I think for us, it's about the fundamental issues. So you've got to make sure Eskom has where I'm sitting right now, I'm getting darker and darker. It's because, you've got to have reliable and affordable electricity. That's the bloodstream for the economy. And we've seen in previous budget statements that when Transnet is struggling, the mining, the manufacturing, agricultural sectors, but especially mining, are not able to get the exports to the markets. That has an immediate deafening blow to the state. The previous MTBS, mining lost about 35 billion rand in company tax, which the state badly needed. So I think for us, we can't do the shortcuts anymore. We've got to do the fundamental issues. And that also means providing a path to employment. You can't sustain a country where you have 12 million South Africans who can't find work. And that's why we've also been really dismayed by the cutting of the bean counting approach, which says let's cut public employment programs. We should be really ramping them up. Doesn't mean we want it forever and a day. No. But you want to really help absorb young people, give them the skills, the experience, the minimum wage that will help them find permanent jobs afterwards. We need to really help support SMEs, to support manufacturers. I think for us, and also maybe the other thing is that let's not beat up the state too much. Thoko is 100% correct. It's our most fundamental tool to changing it on. But we need to have a very frank and honest discussion to say how to unlock the private sector, how to get the private banks, the investment funds, the pension funds to really say, let's invest less overseas. Charity begins at home. Yeah. How can they really help pick up some of the slack the state doesn't have enough money for SME funding, for industrial funding, for export support, for employment programs too. Yeah. There's a huge amount of money, but often is spent on vanity projects, things which we don't really need. And I think we needed to say how to really unlock things, because the state, it's only so much the state can do, to be honest.
Right. And something also, Thokozile, is infrastructure as it relates to job creation. From the documents we've seen, over the next 3 years, public infrastructure spending amounts to more than 1 trillion rand. And these are focused in basically 3 critical areas. We've got transport and logistics, we've got energy infrastructure, we've got water and sanitation. What sort of difference would this make in terms of job creation on one hand, in terms of service delivery on the other?
So again, Blaine, it's the devil in the detail. So we absolutely welcome the focus on infrastructure, except that we would like to see a focus on social infrastructure as well, being driven up in terms of what Matthew is saying, in terms of investing in health, education, social development, so we don't have kids going to pit latrine toilets or schools that are falling apart or hospitals that get burnt down and cannot be repaired. That kind of infrastructure is as important as working on big roads, the transport, Transnet, whatever it might be. But when you look at the detail of the government's policy on this, is that they're hoping, as Matthew has pointed out, that the private sector will come to the party, and that somehow through public-private partnerships or what they call blended finance or de-risking, somehow magically we're going to have this 1 trillion unlocked and things being built. Yeah. And we get told this every year, that, this is going to happen. This year's budget, or the budget that was not tabled, was a little bit more ambitious than we've seen in previous years, the previous year, or even in the medium-term budget policy statement in October. So we welcome that. But the problem is that we need an industrial policy in this country that really focuses on the slump. So we have done research on when spending is required by the state not necessarily just the private sector, but by the state, is when we're in a slump. And South Africa has been in an economic slump for a very long time, if not since 2012, when we implemented what is called austerity fiscal policy or fiscal consolidation.
Right.
And that has resulted in the state reducing the amount of spending on fixed capital infrastructure. And if the state is not investing in fixed capital infrastructure, as in your roads, as in all the things that we've discussed so far, it's unlikely that the private sector is going to have confidence that their factory is going to have a road or electricity or water. So there is a fundamental mismatch here of trying to say cut the state, but then get the state to grow. You know, growth is our problem, but we're not pursuing a growth policy. We're pursuing a cut policy in terms of the state.
Having a helicopter view of the ripple effect is important. Thokozile, thank you so much for your time. Michelle, as always, Matthew, value added, no doubt. That's where we'll have to leave it. Our digital audience, thank you so much indeed. No doubt, tremendous value. We'll continue this conversation in the days and weeks to come until we get to the tabling of the budget. Before we go, here's my take. Look, the tabling of this annual budget is postponed till next month. And yes, I understand that policy uncertainty is never a good thing. And I don't think that anyone thought that reaching consensus in the first budget of the Government of National Unity would be easy. But what's equally important is that we exploit every available avenue of opportunity to alleviate the effects of poverty to ultimately secure your well-being and the economy. Right? It's about leaving politics aside and focusing on economics. What do I mean? Economics 101. It all boils down to the people and the choices they make, how a person gets an income and how they use it. Students deciding whether to work or to study and how that decision affects their future income. So, to the decision makers, let's carefully weigh the benefits and costs so that the decisions that are taken don't cost us our benefits. And that's my take. If you miss anything on this program, then be sure to watch this episode of It's Topical on SABC Plus. There you see it on your screen. We're also on YouTube. Trends Travel up next. If you're watching a repeat of this program, then as always, the news continues. Until next week, my brothers and sisters, take care. Bye-bye.